familiar with Web API Core, of course, is data out, whereas add-edit is essentially data in. And so today we're going to talk about some of the opportunities for each of you in this room, whether you're an MLS, association, brokerage, or a vendor. There's opportunities for each of you when it comes to add-edit. We're going to spend a little bit of time going into what add-edit is for those unfamiliar. We'll get into the showcase aspect of add-edit and let each of these panelists talk about their implementations so that you can see it in practice. And then we'll talk a little bit about the future of add-edit and the opportunities that some of you might be able to seize when it comes to add-edit. So, Richard, I want to start with you. For those unfamiliar with add-edit, tell us about what it is and why it's valuable from the MLS perspective.
Yeah, so from the MLS perspective, our core competencies are aggregation, compliance, and syndication. And aggregation includes being able to bring in the data from multiple different sources to create a central source of truth. That's one of my favorite phrases because it creates that central place that somebody can go to get all the data regardless of what they're looking for. So one of the analogies that I use when it comes to add-edit is we want the member or customer, whatever you call them, to cook us a steak dinner. And right now, we require them to use an electric stove. Now, through compliance, we're still managing what seasonings are they allowed to use, what cut are they supposed to have, how embellished is the plate. But they want to use a grill or a sous vide or any other method of getting the data in. And add-edit allows us to let them use whatever cooking apparatus they want, right? And then we control the data on that compliance piece. So that's what it means to us, is being able to get it in from multiple different locations, eliminating dual entry, and just making it as easy on the member as possible.
Well, that's a fantastic analogy. Let's go to you, Rhett. Rhett, how would you add to that?
Yeah, well, as a broker participant in an MLS, entering listings into multiple MLSs and different platforms and different rules and regulations is hard. It's hard. And at Opendoor, we like to automate and make things very efficient. And this is one of the things that has been a challenge from the beginning, which is finding a better way to leverage business rules and the right technology to efficiently enter data into MLSs. And we've seen there are tools within the community, and certainly the vendor community and the MLS community, that allow some of it. And Richard and I talked early on about it, and it was an easy fit. It's yes, let's do that. But in many ways, there are places and environments and ecosystems where it's still what is it? And how is that going to work? And am I afraid of it? And that's the part really why I was excited about being on this panel and kind of contributing to this conversation, is because I think, this conference started with AI and the world we live in, and this is where we live. And so add-edit really, hopefully, will become more and more mainstream at the broker participant level. So I'm excited to be a part of this.
Absolutely. Well, add-edit is often referenced alongside business rules. And so, Troy, can you tell us about business rules and why they're important to add-edit?
Yeah, unfortunately, you can't do add-edit right now unless you can comply with business rules. So if you want to set up any type of access for any type of vendor or brokers or really anyone, if there isn't well-documented business rules, if there isn't a way to evaluate those business rules against a given listing payload, whether that's a single listing or multiple, if you can't do that, then you can't add the data into the system. It'll just reject it in most circumstances, unless you have very loose validation rules on your systems. So it's a necessity that business rules be incorporated into any add-edit system. And the RESO spec for add-edit, RCP 019, does make room for business rules, but it doesn't spell out exactly how they should be implemented. So that is left up to us to figure out how we want to do that. I think that's not too terribly difficult to achieve either. So there's tools out there that can help you.
Absolutely. Bill, how would you add to that, business rules and add-edit?
Well, I want to go back to something Richard said a second ago, and a lot of people in this room, I think, remember the discussion about RESO standard 1.8, which is initially what add-edit was called way back in the early days. This is when I was at Solid Earth, we were already thinking about how exactly to allow MLSs and people like you to create opportunities for vendors, not just the MLS vendor, to write into the database. And the natural progression of that conversation is an MLS becoming something other than a repository for listing data. Listing data is the story of a property as it's being sold right now. And then we have historical data based on that. But what AdEdit allows you to do, us to do, I think as an industry, is to create value around property data, which is, I think, skipping ahead to the conversations a little bit. It's no longer this, single source of truth is now no longer just for sale or the flyer essentially on a house's existence in time and space. It's a really exciting time for Richard. But again, this is not a new concept, actually a very old concept that started with when RESO first opened the doors.
Absolutely. It's evolved over the years, and there's been a lot of work. I mean, the AdEdit certification might have just released, but there's been a lot that's gone into it and a lot of problems that have been solved. Rhett, can you talk to us about the evolution of AdEdit as a concept from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from my perspective, I mean, as Bill said, it's not new, right? This has been around for years and years. I think we've seen it all happen kind of within more of the vendor space and within more of the vendor partners within MLS, where forms, for example, right, will use AdEdit technology to kind of update listings directly from a form, right, which is a great tool, right? Fantastic. I think part of the acceptance of that is, again, like the agent, right, the professional at that level, that's where they're starting. And so we all understand the need to like meet the agent where they are. And so that's where the agent is. The agent starts on the form, right? So that concept and of course that integration works, and it's prolific, and it's in many, many markets and with many, many MLSs. When it then transitions into the participant or the agent and the data entry into the system itself, I think that's kind of where we've just been, a little behind in terms of like making that more available to everyone. And probably because the brokerages themselves maybe have said, like they don't have the platform to support that. And I think that's what makes Opendoor Brokerage a little bit more unique, because we do, but many, many do. Like many brokerages today in this environment, in this world do. And the more important thing is many more will, right? So that's really where we need to be and what we want to support.
Absolutely. And in that journey, there's been a lot of obstacles, namely around business rules as well. And so, Troy, I was hoping you could talk us through some of those obstacles and how they've been overcome when it relates to the journey of AdEdit and the obstacles with business rules.
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest obstacles that we ran into initially was simply that policy and business rules as documented don't always align. So sometimes you have a well-documented policy that might be promoted to your users, but the business rules themselves are not codified to enforce those same policies. So if you've got a disagreement, if the system forces you to input data in a certain way that actually breaks a policy, then who's right? I think that's one problem that has to be resolved. And, generally an audit can help you take care of that. I would generally recommend an external audit so that you don't have your built-in assumptions in play when you do an audit, just like you would with a financial audit, same thing. But I think the other challenge that we also found was that the rules that are advertised that folks like us can use when we do integrations are sometimes not exactly correct. I might be a little generous on that, but they can be completely wrong, to be quite honest with you. Sometimes the rules give you completely opposite results of what you expect, because the rules that are advertised in metadata, which is a form of code, they're not always precisely reflective of the policy, or somebody who wrote them made a typo, or they just didn't understand the language that they were working with when they put this together. We've seen rules that had so many negatives in them that we couldn't figure out whether something was supposed to be negative or positive. That was a little tough. So, we've developed some tools in order to help us navigate those kinds of problems, like outputting the rules as human language text that is narrative. You can read through it step by step and understand what the rule is supposed to say when it does, and see if that lines up with policy or not. That seems to help a lot. But I think the other thing that's really difficult about rules is that if there's something wrong with a rule, if you don't know where that problem in that rule is, some of them can be quite long expressions in code. If you don't know where the problem is in the rule, you're not really sure how to fix the rule without just rewriting it from scratch. Might be a little tough. So having a point of insertion of where the syntax error in the rule exists is really helpful there too. So, syntactic questions separate from logical questions. You can have a logical error in a rule and never see a syntax error. But if you see a syntax error, knowing exactly where it is in the rule is really helpful. That's also one of the rules, or one of the tools that we developed was a debugger for business rules in order to pinpoint those problems.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into the showcase, I want to circle back to creating value really quickly and why this is important. Bill, where do you believe Ad Edit creates the most value?
Well, I just thought of this, and what you were saying about business rules is the workflow that we have right now is the agent is the arbiter of reality, and so, business rules are designed to help protect us all from whatever that reality today might be, so we channel this data into a very narrow and very controlled environment in order to put listing data in, and that listing data is being put in mostly by an assistant or someone who is an office administrator. But with that edit, you now have an opportunity to this family of vendors that have been pulling data out and then creating value on that data in layers and layers and layers beyond the initial core database. We now have the ability to go back to those vendors and renegotiate these contracts and say, look, hypothetically for a showing vendor, for example, there's a ton of information that comes out of a showing, just the workflow. An MLS now has the ability to, in addition to having an agent who's adding a listing, who's creating that record, you now have a secondary and tertiary and then a long list of other vendors who can then push data back in to the database. And the problem with the business rules, and I think the frustration that we're going to have soon, the friction that we have pretty soon, is we have no place to put it. We have no rules around standardizing how that information is stored so that if MLS A wants to share their showing information with MLS B, hypothetically, then we need RESO to then double down on what the added standards are. Now the dictionary just got a whole lot bigger, a whole lot more important.
Absolutely. Richard, from the MLS perspective, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I love all that, and that's definitely very future looking and things like that. But I kind of even boil it down to a more simple level, is eliminating dual entry. A lot of really great ideas in this industry have died on the vine because we're expecting very busy real estate professionals to do something twice. So I look at it as, if I have a member who has a listing in a property management system, or they have it in their company's own listing system, or they have it, heck, on a legal notepad, I don't care. If there's anything that I can do to eliminate the dual entry and provide value on the other side of getting the data, that makes it significantly more likely for me to get the data in the first place. So that add edit piece is that's the value I see is how I can get more of the data any way you want to give it to me, and then do something with that data to provide the value prop back to the member.
Preach.
100%. And that's a fantastic transition into the showcase itself. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about what each panelist here is doing. So each of you, I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself a little more deeply and your use case and what your company is doing when it comes to ad edit, and maybe we can spark some imagination here. So Bill, why don't we start with you and what you're doing with SourceRE?
So go back to what I earlier said, is having been an MLS vendor for a long time, creating boutique software for MLSs. The link between the database and the front end was a given and has been in our industry for a long time. And then jump ahead, quite a few years to most recently doing MLS consultations. And finding this friction between the front end and the back end is just like all powerful. And so SourceRE is the idea that you can disconnect those two things. They're very important to each other, but the relationship between the data back end and the front end being disconnected, still very closely aligned with each other, but just disconnected from points of interest, I suppose, allows for a lot more malleability with the data, a lot more freedom, versatility, and potentially a lot more profit for the MLS.
Fantastic. Right, why don't we go to you next? Tell us about Ocusell and your ad edit implementation, how you're using ad edit.
Sure. So we started off, we were building a web app to do multiple entries so that you could post into multiple MLSs from one input source. There's a lot of tricks around that have to do with enums that don't match up, list values that aren't equivalent, and text fields that have conflicting rules, business rules for different MLSs, even if they are the same RESO field label. But we got over all of those and built out a really good interface for doing multiple listing entry from a single form. And that was working pretty well, but we had to hard code all of the business rules into that same app. which is not terribly scalable. So we really want to be able to cover every MLS that ever wants to use our system. That's where we want to be. So for us, we had to turn that into a dynamic system, which we call Gen A, generated ad edit. But it's a dynamic system that takes the structure of the data from the MLS for a listing and for all the different types of listings, takes the business rules as metadata as well, and basically auto-populates a form. We provide a little bit of human guidance in order to give it field ordering and groupings, a couple of things like that. And some workflow rules aren't exactly easy to automate right now. We've got some of those rules still hard-coded in our app. But we also needed a rules engine. It became clear that we needed a rules engine as we were working on this. So we developed something called Rosetta Stone, which is now available. And that really helps us to store the rules themselves, offer them to others as a rule set, a rule resource in the RESO terminology. We have a RESO compliant rules resource that it advertises for others to use and ingest it from. It can also translate the rules between different syntaxes. So from Rhett's validation expressions to RESO validation expressions. We're working with Reber. We're going to see what we can do with Reber. A little bit of limitations there. But we also really needed a way for analysts to be able to read those rules and understand them. So we made that human output as well, the readable human output. So that's Rosetta Stone. That works together with our web app. At the back end of our system, our web app, we wanted to work like a modern development shop as far as developing software goes. And we wanted to write RESTful API calls so that we could do this. And the systems we're building with don't have that available to us. They do have RETs. It's old. It's not really the technology we want to work with, but it works. And we can insert and update data through RETs. But we didn't want to write all of that logic into our web app because it just clutters the web app with a lot of functionality that it doesn't need. So instead, we took the RESO reference implementation server, which is a Java app that acts as a database for a model for what you would store property data in data dictionary format. We added some components to it. We added the ad edit API specification and we coded all of that. We've contributed that back to RESO, and hopefully Josh will have some time to look over that source code soon and be able to release that to the public. We wanted to give that back to the community because we want everybody to have access to a working and improved implementation of an ad edit API spec. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to contribute that work back to the community. But with that, we also realized that we needed publishing plugins that basically work on the back end of that server. That server is now called Meridian. It's its own product, and you can use it as a separate product from our editor. You don't have to use our editor if you don't want, but it's pretty agnostic. It presents a RESO web API ad edit interface for the developers to write to. And then on the back end, it automates the publishing cycle for RETs. We've got 2 flavors of RETs implemented now. We can also do batch file processing. We can also do proprietary APIs if somebody wants to open those up to us. So we can actually write more adapters for that as well.
That's great. And recently, both of you announced that SourceRE and Ocusell, of course, have the integration. And you mentioned Rosetta Stone and SourceRE using Rosetta Stone. Tell us a little bit about that integration between SourceRE and Ocusell and how you can integrate to use ad edit. Bill, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, SourceRE is the database. It's the storage, it's the management of the data, and more importantly, possibly it's the tracking of that entire workflow. But there is no listing input, so there's no lim attached to SourceRE, which is where you need someone like an Ocusell that can translate that data, use the business rules from potentially a variety of sources, from a variety of different MLS platforms. A lot of innovation, it turns out, is held back by the inability of these large platforms to speak to each other. So Ocusell has really solved that problem. So we have created this independent database to allow MLSs to do what they will with their own data, and then to track that data flow from data in, data storage, data out, and then tracking beyond.
Fantastic. Well,
Can I add one thing real quick? Sam when we got together for a rehearsal, we talked through some of these topics. Sam DeBoard mentioned that one of his aspirations for RESO is to make sure that every RESO member has access to some kind of ad edit technology, however that works. Because ultimately, if we're going to make a value-added data universe where other people pearl certification, there's a lot of different things that we can pull data in from external vendors that adds more value to the listing. And I think the people that you're seeing on the stage right now, all of us are really committed to finding ways to make that ad edit functionality available to all of tech. That's really what we're kind of about right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. It's very nice to see two people already integrating and using ad edit. And I'd love to go to you next, Rhett. Tell us a little bit more about you and Opendoor and how you're using ad edit in practice. Yep.
Well, I would start with just ad edit APIs in general, right, as a tech company. So it's everywhere, right? So inside of our ecosystem, we have many, many, many different applications. Some are vendor sourced, some are homegrown, that talk to each other that way. And as humans going out and doing things in an application and then updating another one, that's simple, right? Sounds like a listing agent and an MLS. So at our core, this all happens in the background. And so within the brokerage team, when we say we can't do that inside of these ecosystems, at least easily, we get a lot of this. Like, what? That doesn't compute, right? Because it does make a lot of sense and it can be seamless. So I think it's important to realize, again, that that's where a lot of your customers, the broker participants, are and where they exist, and certainly where their vendor community exists. And it's, I get that it's, there's a lot to break down, right? And to talk about and figure out, right? And I really commend Troy and team with the kind of tackling business rules, because that is the hardest part. And that's the part that really kind of bogs everyone down, right? In that process. And I also recognize that for Opendoor, we're probably a little simpler when it comes to the business rules based on the way that we operate, which is why, I'd love to raise my hand here for anyone to say, we'd love to pilot any ad edit out there with vendor or with MLS, because I think we're a perfect use case to kind of step into that gently, cautiously, but also probably have a pretty good result pretty fast. So with that context, then what we're able to do today is try to take advantage of either the MLSs or the vendors that offer some form of ad edit. And where we've seen that most successfully is open house ad edit. So if the MLS or the vendor or their vendor supports that, we absolutely use it. It's a use case for us where, again, we tend to host more open houses than perhaps a traditional brokerage. And so there's a lot of entry there, because as we know, for an open house, it's almost like a listing, because you have to go for that day and time and do it repeatedly. So it's a simple integration or an API payload, but it works, right? And it saves a tremendous amount of time, which we can kind of get into.
Absolutely. And I'd love to hear more about the results and the value it's created. I mean, are you getting it used and people are very happy with it, or what have the results been like?
Well, in that regard, yes. So the results from our end are pretty clear. And a great example is in one MLS where we list a lot of homes, leveraging just the open house API. We went from something that took people and licensees 20 to 30 hours a month, if you aggregated it all up, using the API, just the open house API, took 2 minutes. 2 minutes, right? And that is a clear win for everyone. It's a clear win for the industry. And of course it's credentialed, and of course it's spec'd and specified, right? But it works. And so of course, once we did that, we're like, can we do this everywhere, right? Like, where else can we do this? Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of the beginning of then when Rich and I had this conversation. And then within that, there are other fields that have been, I should say, permissioned by MLSs to update via API, status, price. Those are few and far between in my experience, in our experience. And then there are some cases where the feature exists within the application, but the permission to use it isn't granted.
Yeah.
And that's really, again, where I'd love to have that conversation as to why. And I think perhaps it's because it's misunderstood, or perhaps it's because it feels like a threat, or it feels like something that not everyone can do, which everyone can do. So again, that's really, we'd love to do it everywhere. But it's definitely been, it shows its value. And I think it's clear that the efficiency makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Well, that's very exciting. And I'd love to hear some more of those use cases. I'll ask you about that in a moment. But Richard, I want to go to you. And how has Southwest MLS used AdEdit in practice?
Yeah, so you guys were at Fall, you saw us talk about Rental Beast. And, I mentioned a little while ago, property management systems. So, there are members and non-members who enter their data into property management systems in Albuquerque. They're entering into, Appfolio, Buildium, Yardi, there's like 37 of them, I think. And we are ingesting that data, even the non-member data. Now, not all of it makes it into the MLS. We can talk more about that later. But when you're talking about access to listings, my members went from access to about 3,000 listings to about 19,000 listings. When you look at the rental space, it's people really only put the most expensive stuff into the MLS because everything else, they hang a piece of paper in their window and it's gone, right? So we thought our median sale price was about $2,500, median rent price, I'm sorry. Now that we're getting more of the data from Rental Beast, we're seeing it's actually more like $1,500 because now we're getting all the listings, not just the ones they need us for. And the reason that we're getting all the listings, not just the ones they need us for, is because we have eliminated the dual entry. We've made it where they can very easily go in and claim their listing. And Rental Beast this week is actually launching a new version of that auto claim that makes it even easier for that to happen. They're actively invested in helping us get the data as MLS data, not just Rental Beast data. And then, speaking to what Rhett was saying about being an easy use case, rental has significantly less fields than residential. Residential is this big monster that nobody wants to touch because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Which I hate that saying, by the way. I think you should break it. Side note, I look forward to the day we never hear the word Rhett's on stage anymore. But it was a good use case to start with. Limited number of fields, doesn't affect as many members. And through that, I've brought on 30 property managers in the last 10 months that weren't members before. So it's serving a new space, it's getting more data, it's eliminating dual entry, and then now I can take the next step and see what I'm doing with it next.
What do you plan to do with the next?
So our next step is on the rental side, we want to continue building that out. We are going to start actively going out to the property managers who are not members and being like, hey, this is why you should become a member. And by the way, these 30 people that we joined is over the perceived objection of I have to also become a realtor. So they're not joining just because they're over the objection of I have to also be a realtor. They're still joining. So we're going to lean into that, and we're going to keep bringing in more members that we didn't have previously. Next steps for AdEdit, we're talking new construction. That's another place that the MLS has generally underserved, and there's places where new construction has their places they're putting their data into. So why don't we ingest that data ourselves? Just continuing to look at the other underserved markets that MLS has traditionally not done a good job with and start bringing in those members. It's one of the things I always say is if you're at the Netflix board of directors and they're talking about a possible drop in subscribers, what are they going to do? They're going to find ways to add more subscribers. So that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at the underserved markets. I'm bringing in subscribers that have traditionally not been a part of the MLS and increasing revenue during a time when most people aren't.
That's exciting. And that's a really good transition into talking a little bit more about the future of AdEdit and some of the opportunities for everyone in this room. I want to go back to you, Rhett. Tell us, who is AdEdit for? Is it just for the big players, or who in the room can take advantage of these opportunities?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's for everyone, really. And that's what the industry has to build for, right? It's for everyone. It's like what Richard just said. Like you want that in your ecosystem. You want to make it freely and easily available. I mean, we succeed in this category when the brokerage of one or two or three can leverage at it, right? And when all the business rules are templated and, exhaustively kind of completed and made, it's kind of like that's already been thought about, right? Don't worry about that, right? Use this application, use this tool, use this system. For it's certainly, I think right now in this space, it's like anything else. It's the companies that have the engineers and the companies that have the brokerages that have the platforms and can invest in the database that can help lead and leverage and test and pilot, right? But it becomes available for all. And that's really where we're going, right? We're going there. We're there already as we started. Like that this isn't new. It's happening all the time. But the notion of it happening just as simply as that participant, that broker, that agent leveraging an ad edit tool that does something in 2 minutes is still a little, we're not there yet. But that's really who will all benefit. So hope that answers your question.
Follow up to that, you mentioned open houses.
Yeah.
How else would you expand it, or what other opportunities?
Well, open house is easy, for sure. But I mean, obviously, in our use case for listing within the brokerage, it's price changes, status changes, agent remarks, things that we use easily and more universally across in the market, right, to make those changes. So within the MLS system, that's really where we see the benefit of doing that. Within other systems, I mean, we have external vendors. We use ShowingTime nationwide for all of our agent access and agent showings, and we have an API with them, right? So that integration works really well, and it makes things much, much easier than it did when we were doing that ourselves, right? In terms of, and that's an API that we use with ShowingTime. So the sense of the ability to be able to use these APIs and inside the MLS system to add edit will help, again, will help everyone.
No doubt there. And looking at it from the perspective of MLS director, going to you, Richard, what ad edit innovations do you think will create the most value for members?
So during our prep call, I don't remember which one of you three brought it up the first time, but we talked about this term of input of choice. And, everybody's always said, like, things like Ocusell are a front end of choice. But the problem with that is we're kind of implying that it's another thing to learn. I like input of choice better, because you have things like, Lundy was just up here a second ago, voice ad edit. What about, flying a drone through a house, computer vision type ad edit? What about, what was it? OpenAI had the demo where like they drew the website and then had the scan and then it built the website. Why can't you get the emeritus member's yellow legal notepad that he's drawn out and wrote down the listing on, scan that, ad edit? Like just anything that makes it easier for the member to input the data. And I feel like there's a big opportunity there to move beyond the listing form, because the control piece of it, like a couple of guys here have mentioned, MLS is worried about lack of control. We don't need to control aggregation. We control it in compliance. And if you're not controlling it in compliance, you have bigger problems. But, it's like, that's the part where we keep the control. It's so just any way that we can get the data in, let's make it happen.
Andrew, if I can add something, I think I may have missed part of that question, just like in other areas that we're using this. One area that we're seeing a lot of adoption now, and we wouldn't have seen this a couple of years ago, it is back to the Opendoor cash offer. And so I think the idea of an iBuyer being something to fear is less the case now, and it's become more mainstream. And so we're seeing a lot of opportunities from large brokerages who have said, hey, we'd like to partner with you in that space, right? And so that, again, is the beginning of an agent. We launched this a few weeks ago with EXP nationwide. So we power the portal for their agents to request a cash offer for their seller if that's an option that their seller wants. And so that, again, is the beginning of, right, using API technology for a brokerage to begin have their agents start with listing information, right? And then quickly decide, like, is this an option that I want to offer my client?
That's a really good example. Yeah. Okay. Last question, follow up, you, Richard. For the prop tech vendors in the room, does that mean you're going to be looking at ad edit capabilities a little more closely when you're doing vendor evaluation?
Absolutely. I mean, I've always, like, recently I really started looking at ceiling and floor. Like, okay, what you're bringing me right now is your floor. So where's the ceiling? What's next? Like, if we're going to sign this contract, what are we doing 3 years from now? And let's start thinking about that. And because if we can't think ahead to that point, then I'm not sure I want to work with you. If we can't co-create together, that's one of my new favorite words from FBS, then I'm not sure we want to work together. So, of course, you have to, what was the other term I heard recently? Pivotware. You got to kind of avoid that a little bit. But it's more just having the discussion to make sure that, we can build together and get to that next level. So it's absolutely a part of our every discussion.
Wow, that's a big statement for the prop tech vendors for certain. So I want to move on to talk about data independence. Bill, what is your perspective on ad edit empowering the MLS and the MLS value proposition?
Yeah, great question. And I was eager to answer Richard's question from a second ago.
Yeah.
I was doing all the body language things to say I wanted to say something on topic. So the aspect of the independence of data is around there's no longer an excuse for an MLS when an agent says, hey, I'm going to an open house and the consumer has more information than I do. We've heard that for a long time. It's because as MLSs, we have had one thing, one asset, and that asset is the listing information on a property, which is really, again, my metaphor is like it's the flyer. It's the thing that says this house is for sale, here's how much it's for sale, here's the attributes of that house, kind of the end of the story. So in the room, Pearl certification, real reports, not in the room, but Area Hub, there are a long list of young and very eager companies that have property-related data that they are almost literally throwing at your feet. And so there's no longer an excuse for you to say, well, is this valuable? How is this valuable? Is there a rev share? All valid questions. But we can no longer make the case that listing data is the only thing that we have responsibility over. Like the MLS is transforming before our eyes, really on this stage at this event. We're going to look back at this and say that was a pivotal RESO because this cresting wave of progress is now crashing. And I mean crashing in a really good way. Every MLS has been excused to do all the things that we have been sitting on our hands about for so long. So the data independence means open the box to include anything that will really benefit the consumer. We're going to get right down to it. Who is our customer? It's the buyer and seller. Because if we're looking at attrition, if we're looking at agent counts going down, I mean, we can all wait for something great to happen and hope this all goes away, or we can become something different. And the difference is increase your value. Take some of the pillars out of the existing business model of the MLS and add new ones, better ones. And that's what data independence does.
Absolutely. And Troy, I'd like to give you a chance to add to that as well from a business rules perspective, how it's empowered the MLS and secures the ability to even complete these integrations.
So I think an analogy might be in order. So I would say that, if you think about your data for your listings, your showings, your membership information, all of that data is kind of like your car. And when you don't have ad edit, you're kind of on a closed track. You can only go so many places. And your car only really has so much value. It's an okay car. It's not a great car, right? But when you have ad edit, one thing that happens is all of a sudden your car goes up in value. It goes from a Hyundai to a Corvette or something, right? You suddenly have all this additional value on your data added to it. So it's not even work that you necessarily had to do other than just opening up the possibility to let other people add value to your data, right? So the car gets better. But the other thing is that the ad edit kind of opens you and takes you off of the closed track. And now you're open on the open road. You can run on, the whole highway system is open to you. You can go anywhere you want. And you can go, you can pull on all of these different resources and be able to pull those into your system. You can invent new workflows. You can invent new, there was a recent thing where RESO adopted a couple of extra fields that had to do with brokers or with agent safety on site when you're doing showing, right? It's had to do with stuff like, the power's out. Or, there's a big hole in the front yard or whatever, there's safety issues around some homes, right? Well, you can imagine that it would be really nice if somebody who's doing a showing and power goes out while they're doing the showing, it'd be really great if they could go into the showing app and say, power just went out. So the next person who's going to show up is going to know before they get there that the power's out of the property. Now, if you don't have ad edit, how's that data going to get to that person? It's not. So we lose all of those opportunities to improve the entire workflow of the system. You know, we can reduce the amount of man hours that we spend managing this data and inputting the data, and we can increase the value of that data by just working less, but just working smarter. That's, I think, really what it's all about.
Absolutely. And I want to take a minute, let each of you maybe summarize your thoughts, make the final case to the crowd, why ad edit is important and why it should matter to them. Start with you.
Yeah, so it's actually a really great segue of what Troy was just talking about. Is another thing we think about often is in any given transaction, how many people touch that transaction? And it's, I don't know, 20, 30. How many people in that transaction are we asking for data from? One. So just right there alone, I mean, why can't we get data from appraisers? Why can't we get data from people who show the property? Why can't we get data from the buyer? You know, so there's a lot more this can do than just where we're starting. We had to start somewhere, and that's why I started with the rental property type, because it was an easy start. But where this can grow to is like what Bill's been talking about, is we get all this data from all these different places and then transform it and provide it back in useful ways. And that's what matters, and that's where this is going. Rhett?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that. I mean, I said it earlier, 20 hours to 2 minutes, right? I mean, that is as clear as it gets and as beneficial as it gets for everyone. And I think the easier that we make it and the more universal we make it, the richer the data set is and the more valuable the MLS system is. And I love Troy's example, right? Because as you were saying that about the power out or things like that, I was just thinking about all the things that occur and all the things that talk to each other, then they stop. They stop talking, and they don't have to, right? They could talk, and if they were to talk and communicate via an API, for example, then things would go from 20 hours to 2 minutes, and that would be wonderful.
Yes. Bill.
Well, it's so nice to finally be having this discussion. It's so nice to finally be talking about ad edit in present tense, and to have those certifications being one. By the way, like one gigantic shout out to Josh Darnell. Like, can we all just like say, thank you, Bob. Like I was just, you do the math in your head. You're like, how many RESOs have I been to? And like, so many drinks. So many drinks that we finally get to have these conversations about what our core values are, and to be able to have, an MLS on a panel like this talking about not only like what can we do, what could we do, what should we do, it's what are we doing. And it's just like it's a celebration of the industry where we've gotten to be able to have people talking about, perfectly malleable listing input based on business rules, like doing the dirty work of the industry to get to the point where we're actually building, rebuilding our value. Where we can be reactive and also proactive for the first time. I don't know, it feels very refreshing to be able to have this conversation. Look, patting ourselves collectively on the back for getting to this point.
Absolutely. Troy, last but not least.
When I showed up at my first RESO conference 2 years ago, talking with anybody about ad edit was an exercise of futility. And that's what we're all about. That's what we set out to do. And, quite honestly, we're just not that easy to dissuade. So we came back, and we kept coming back, and we kept talking to people, and we kept showing them demos and things. We kept talking to them about what the possibilities were. And I agree with everything that all of these panelists have said up here today. I think they've made fantastic points. And I can't really augment that too much. But, I guess the one thing that I'll say is that I'm going to bring it back to business rules for just a moment. Because in that analogy I was giving with the car, the closed circuit, ad edit gives you the ability to go out on the open highway. Those business rules really have to be an essential component of that, because they're basically the traffic laws. If we all follow the traffic laws, everybody can get to their destination where they want to go in a reasonable fashion, in a reasonable time. But if we don't have good rules enforcement on all of that data, if we don't have good workflow enforcement on all of that workflow too, and we're not really building a better system, right? We're just opening it up to random data, which I don't think anybody wants. But the whole point of this is to have control over that process in order to be able to use these technologies to solve new problems that we haven't addressed before. And that's really what we're all trying to do, is help everyone figure out how to solve those problems creatively and invent new solutions we haven't even thought about yet. And I'm looking for opportunities to find out what new use cases that you might have for systems like Rosetta Stone and for Meridian and for our editor and for SourceRE. These all have powerful use cases that we probably have not even thought of before. So we invite you to come talk to us and tell us what you think that this might be able to help you accomplish that's really bugging you, that's a problem on your mind.
Absolutely.
And I hope that in another year or so, when we come back and we have a follow-up on ad edit at some point, I hope that everybody's just in the midst of doing all of their wonderful workflows that they've thought of and improving their businesses and improving the value of their business.
Absolutely. Well, if you would like a word with any of these fantastic panelists, we will be at the front of the stage when the lunch break starts. So come and ask them questions and get to know ad edit a little bit better. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.